Chicago, 1892. The air smelled of coal smoke and rain as horse-drawn carriages splashed through the streets. Inside a modest studio on Clark Street, Eleanor Carter adjusted the curtains to let in the right amount of light. Her camera stood proudly on a wooden tripod, the brass lens gleaming even in the dim afternoon. Eleanor wasn't rich, nor did she come from a famous family, but she carried within her the wisdom of her late father, who had once told her, "Photography is not just about capturing faces, Ellie. It's about capturing truth, even when people don't want it seen." That day, an ordinary customer walked in, a railroad worker with soot-stained hands, heavy boots, and a weariness in his eyes. His name was Samuel Whitaker. "I just need a photo to send to my mother," he explained, voice rough from shouting over trains. "She hasn't seen me in years." Eleanor smiled kindly. "Then let's give her a picture she'll treasure." She arranged Samuel against a simple backdrop, lifted the lens cap, and held her breath as the shutter captured the moment. Later, in her small dark room, she waited as the image slowly bloomed across the glass plate. But as the picture came alive, Eleanor froze. Behind Samuel's shoulder, faint yet unmistakable, was another man. A figure who had never stepped into her studio. The image sent shivers up Eleanor's spine. She wiped her hands on her apron and brought the plate into the studio. "Mr. Whitaker," she said carefully, "take a look." Samuel leaned closer, squinting at the photograph. His face paled. What in God's name? There was no one there. The figure was tall, with sharp eyes and a scar across his cheek. A face carved by cruelty. He stood in the background like a shadow, watching Samuel. Samuel tried to laugh it off. "Maybe it's a trick of the light or a smudge in your chemicals." Eleanor shook her head. "No, I've worked too long with plates to mistake a smudge for a man's face." She didn't say the rest of what she was thinking, that she had seen that face before. Not in person, but on the wanted posters plastered outside the police station. The man in the photo looked exactly like Edward Callahan, the notorious political fixer rumored to control half the city's crooked officials. Eleanor hesitated, torn between fear and duty. Should she tell Samuel the truth? At last, she lowered her voice. I think this man is Edward Callahan." Samuel's head snapped up. "Callahan? The one tied to disappearances on the South Side?" Eleanor nodded grimly. "He's dangerous. If this image is real, if he was somehow present in my studio, then you're in grave danger." Samuel rubbed his temples. "Lately I've felt eyes on me when I walk home. I thought it was just in my head. But this..." He tapped the photograph with trembling fingers. "This proves it." Outside, the noise of the city continued as if nothing had changed. Horses trotting, vendors shouting. But inside Eleanor's little studio, both knew their lives had just crossed into something much larger, much darker. Eleanor tried to reason it out. Perhaps Callahan was nearby, and the exposure caught him through the window. But no, the angle doesn't make sense. Samuel shook his head. "He shouldn't even know who I am. I'm just a worker, nothing more." But as they talked, Samuel's memory began to stir. Weeks earlier, while repairing a section of rail, he had accidentally overheard a conversation between his foreman and a wealthy businessman. They were discussing falsified contracts, ways to cheat workers out of their wages. Samuel hadn't meant to listen, but the words had stuck in his mind. Now he realized someone must have seen him there. The photograph wasn't a mistake. It was a warning. Chicago in 1892 was a city of contradictions. On one hand, the skyline rose with new steel marvels, and preparations for the world's Columbian Exposition promised to show the world America's greatness. On the other, labor strikes rocked the railroads, poverty choked entire neighborhoods, and whispers of corruption spread like wildfire. Men like Edward Callahan thrived in this chaos. He was never elected to office, but everyone knew his hand was in city contracts, police promotions, and even court cases. Workers feared him, politicians obeyed him, and journalists struggled to prove his crimes. And now, a single photograph, taken by a modest young photographer, had placed Samuel Whitaker at the center of this dangerous web. Eleanor wrestled with her conscience for a night before making her decision. She could not stay silent. The next morning, she marched into the Chicago Police Department, clutching the photograph wrapped in cloth. Inside, she found Detective Michael Hanley, a weary man with a reputation for integrity. "Detective, you don't know me," Eleanor began, "but I have something you need to see." Hanley looked skeptical as he unwrapped the plate. "Lady, you think a smudge on glass proves anything? We need witnesses, not shadows." But as he studied the scarred face in the background, his expression changed. He leaned closer, jaw tightening. "That's him," he muttered. "That's Callahan. And if he's this close to your worker friend, then your friend's already marked." When Eleanor told Samuel what the detective had said, he went pale. "I didn't want this," he whispered. "All I wanted was to earn my pay and send money to my mother. Now I've got one of the most powerful men in Chicago breathing down my neck." Eleanor touched his arm gently. "Sometimes we don't choose the fight. The fight chooses us." Samuel shook his head. "Do you realize what Callahan does to people who cross him? They vanish, Eleanor. Their names never appear in papers again." But Eleanor's determination grew stronger. "That's why we can't stay quiet. This photograph could be the crack in his armor. If the city sees it, maybe others will find the courage to speak." Samuel stared at her, torn between fear and admiration. For the first time, he saw in Eleanor not just a photographer, but a woman with unshakable conviction. The days that followed were filled with whispered meetings and tense nights. Samuel often stayed at Eleanor's studio, afraid to walk home alone. She would brew him tea and listen as he spoke about his childhood in Kansas, his dreams of owning a little farm someday, far away from the smoke and corruption of the city. In turn, Eleanor shared her memories of her father, how he'd taught her to see the world differently, to notice the smallest details others ignored. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Samuel said softly, "You risked everything by helping me." "Why?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Because truth matters, and because no one deserves to fight alone." Though their bond was not yet love, it was something stronger than friendship. An alliance of two ordinary souls caught in extraordinary danger. Realizing they needed more than the police, Eleanor sought out Clara Jennings, a young reporter at the Chicago Tribune. Clara was known for chasing stories no one else dared to print. When Eleanor and Samuel laid the photograph on her desk, Clara's eyes widened. "Do you realize what you've brought me? If this is real, it could bring Callahan down." Samuel shifted uneasily. "Or get us killed." Clara tapped the photo thoughtfully. "The city's been hungry for proof. But if we publish this, you'll both have targets on your backs. Are you willing to risk that?" Eleanor answered firmly, "The risk is already here. Better to face it in daylight than hide in the dark." Clara nodded. "Then let's shake Chicago to its core." The danger grew quickly. One evening, Samuel noticed two men trailing him as he left the rail yard. Their coats were too fine for laborers, and their eyes too sharp to be casual pedestrians. Samuel's pulse quickened. He darted into an alley, weaving through crates and barrels until he burst into Eleanor's studio, gasping for breath. "They're following me," he said, clutching the doorframe. "Two men! I swear they know about the photo." Eleanor bolted the door, her hands trembling. For the first time, the danger felt immediate, not distant. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly outside before fading away into the night. Inside, Eleanor and Samuel sat in silence, hearts pounding. The truth they carried was powerful, but it had also painted a target on their backs. And now, Chicago's shadows were closing in. Clara's reporting was meticulous. She dug into city records, whispered with informants, and tracked the hidden connections between Edward Callahan and the city's powerful elite. But one evening, she came to Eleanor's studio, her face pale. "Someone leaked word about the photo," Clara whispered. "Not just Callahan. Half the city council knows about it now." Samuel stiffened. "How?" "We only spoke to you, the detective, and each other." Clara clenched her fists. "That's what frightens me. Someone close to us, maybe even within the Tribune or the police, is feeding him information. You two aren't just being watched, you're being hunted." The thought of betrayal cut deeper than the fear of Callahan himself. Eleanor stared at the photo lying on her desk. For the first time, she wondered whether the truth was too dangerous to reveal. Her doubts turned to terror just days later. Near midnight, a crash echoed through her studio window. Eleanor woke with a scream as glass shattered. Shadowy figures stormed inside, overturning tables, scattering chemicals. Samuel fought them off with sheer desperation, swinging a stool until one man fled. But by the time the chaos ended, Eleanor's worst fear had come true. The original glass plate was gone. She collapsed onto the floor, tears stinging her eyes. "It's over. They've destroyed the only proof we had." Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder, wincing from bruises. "Not the only proof." From beneath a false drawer in her desk, Eleanor pulled out a small envelope. Inside lay a perfect duplicate of the photograph. "My father taught me," she whispered, "to always keep a second negative hidden. Truth must have a safeguard." Samuel let out a shaky laugh. "You just may be the bravest soul in Chicago." Within a week, Clara's article hit the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The headline screamed, "The Shadow Behind the Worker, Proof of Edward Callahan's Reach." The image showed Samuel's weary but honest face, with Callahan's figure lurking just behind. Chicago exploded. Workers gathered in the streets, chanting for justice. Families passed the newspaper from hand to hand, whispering that maybe, just maybe, the powerful could be held accountable. In taverns and streetcars, ordinary people debated aloud. If a single worker can stand up to Callahan, why can't we all? For the first time in years, hope stirred in the city's heart. Hope, however, came with a cost. Callahan's men struck back swiftly. One cold evening, Samuel was ambushed near the rail yard. Two men dragged him into the shadows and beat him mercilessly, leaving him bruised and broken in the mud. When Eleanor found him in the hospital, her heart shattered. His face was swollen, his ribs cracked, yet he still tried to smile through the pain. "Eleanor," he whispered, "if one photo can rattle them this much, imagine what more truth could do." Tears blurred her vision, but she clasped his hand tightly. "I won't let them silence you, Samuel. Not now, not ever." His resilience gave her new strength. Public outcry grew so fierce that the city was forced to act. Edward Callahan and several allies were arrested. A trial was set, though everyone knew Callahan's money and influence could twist verdicts. On the day Eleanor testified, the courtroom was packed. Workers squeezed shoulder to shoulder, reporters scribbling furiously. The judge asked her to present her evidence. With trembling hands, Eleanor held up the photograph. "This image," she said, voice steadying, "is not a trick of light. It is not a mistake. It is the truth. And truth, no matter how hidden, will always find its way into the light." Her words hung in the silence. Even hardened men shifted uneasily in their seats. For a moment, Eleanor felt her father's presence beside her, proud of the courage she had found. Against all odds, the jury convicted Edward Callahan. Gasps filled the courtroom as the verdict was read. For the first time in decades, a man thought untouchable was brought down. Chicago's streets erupted in celebration. Workers cheered, newspapers hailed the victory, and even children ran through alleys shouting, "Callahan's finished!" Samuel, still weak but smiling, turned to Eleanor. "You didn't just save me. You saved the city's spirit." She shook her head softly. "No, Samuel. We all did it. Together." In the weeks that followed, collectors and wealthy patrons came knocking. They offered Eleanor fortunes for the photograph, calling it the image that changed Chicago. But she refused every offer. "This photo," she explained to Clara, "doesn't belong locked in a rich man's gallery. It belongs to the people who found courage because of it. It's not mine to sell. It's Chicago's." Instead, she donated the photograph to a humble workers' hall, where anyone could come and see it for free. It became a symbol, not of one woman's fame, but of an entire city's fight for justice. Though Samuel had grown close to Eleanor, his heart ached for home. His mother in Kansas was aging, and she needed him. One quiet evening, he came to her studio, suitcase in hand. "I have to go back," he said softly. "My place is with her now. But I'll never forget what we did here." Eleanor smiled bravely, though her chest tightened. "You taught me that even the smallest voice matters, Samuel. Don't ever forget that yourself." They embraced for a long moment, two ordinary souls who had faced extraordinary darkness together. When he left, Eleanor stood at the window long after his figure disappeared into the night. Years passed. Chicago grew, skyscrapers rose, and the scars of corruption slowly healed. In a modest community hall, the photograph still hung proudly. People came to see it: workers, students, dreamers. Some touched the frame as though drawing strength from it. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "When truth hides in shadows, courage will bring it to light." Eleanor often visited quietly, blending in with the crowd. She would watch strangers study the photo, see determination flicker in their eyes, and smile. She never told them she was the one behind the camera. That wasn't important. What mattered was the message. Truth belonged to everyone. One snowy morning, years later, a letter arrived at Eleanor's door. The handwriting was rough but familiar. Inside was a faded photograph of Samuel, older now, with lines on his face, but smiling warmly. Beside him stood his family, his mother, frail but radiant, his wife, and two children with eyes full of wonder. On the back of the photo, Samuel had written in careful script, "Eleanor, I lived a good life because of that one photograph. You gave me more than safety. You gave me hope and the courage to believe the smallest voices matter. Thank you for everything. Your friend always, Samuel Whitaker." Eleanor pressed the letter to her heart. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of peace. She walked to the community hall that afternoon and stood before the photograph that had changed her life. Around her, people still whispered in awe. A single hidden truth, captured by her lens in 1892, had illuminated countless lives. And though history books would never mention Eleanor Carter or Samuel Whitaker by name, the legacy of their courage lived on in every heart that dared to face the shadows with light.